Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive?
Mm.
Today we're taking a look at the Panama Canal.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's not just some ditch dug through a jungle. This thing's a total game changer for global trade and a total flashpoint right now.
Yeah, I've been seeing that in the news lately. It's getting pretty heated down there.
Yeah, for sure. To get a handle on what's going on, we've got a whole stack of stuff. Historical accounts, all about how the canal got built.
Right.
And then some recent articles about all this tension between the U.S. and Panama.
Mm-hmm.
We even found a piece by a former Panamanian diplomat.
Oh, wow.
Who's, let's just say they've got some thoughts.
That's going to be interesting.
It is. So the big question is, what's next for the Panama Canal? But first, to understand that, we got to go back, way back in the beginning.
That's right.
Exactly. Late 1800s when they first took a crack at it.
Ambitious, to say the least.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine carving a path through this dense jungle with, 19th century tools?
No bulldozers, no power tools.
And on top of that, disease running rampant. They were up against it from the start.
And what really took them down?
Mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes, seriously.
Yeah. Malaria and yellow fever, spread by those little guys, just ravaged their workforce.
Oh, wow.
It's estimated that 20,000 French workers died.
That's just devastating.
Yeah. They ended up giving up after 9 years.
So engineering is only part of the story.
Huge lesson there.
Yeah.
Public health, just as important as any bridge or dam, especially in a place like that.
Okay, so the French pack up, go home, defeated by these tiny mosquitoes.
Right.
Then the U.S. steps in, 1903.
Right.
How did they manage to beat the disease?
Well, it wasn't some magic bullet or anything, but they had this engineer, John F. Stevens. He realized you can't build anything if everyone's sick.
Right.
So sanitation became priority number one before they even started digging.
Smart.
They drained swamps, attacked the mosquitoes, improved housing, all that stuff.
So Stevens basically added public health expert to his resume.
Pretty much. And it made all the difference. The U.S. was finally able to make some real progress where the French had failed.
Okay, so disease is more or less under control. Then comes the real heavy lifting. Literally. Blasting through mountains, creating a lake, and this crazy lock system to lift ships up and over the continent.
It's hard to even grasp the scale of it.
I'm boggled.
Steam shovels tearing through the Culebra Cut. Huge, powerful machines, but still.
I bet.
Then the Gatun Dam, creating this enormous artificial lake.
Gatun Lake, right.
Yeah. And of course the locks, this ingenious system to raise and lower the ships. It's just incredible.
Yeah, it's a marvel of engineering, for sure. But it's important to remember the human costs, too.
Absolutely.
Even with the improvements in sanitation, another 5,000 workers died during the American construction phase.
Bringing the total to 25,000, a tragic reminder of the sacrifices made.
Yeah. So the canal opens, 1914. It changes everything. Global trade, shipping routes, the whole game.
Yeah.
The U.S. doesn't just build it. They control it. And not just the canal itself, but the Panama Canal Zone.
Right. That strip of land, 5 miles wide on each side of the canal. American territory, right through the heart of Panama.
You're kidding. Like their own little mini-state.
Yeah, pretty much. And as you can imagine, that didn't sit well with everyone.
Especially as anti-colonial movements started gaining momentum.
Exactly. The idea of one country controlling this vital waterway in another country, it was, let's say it became a problem.
A big problem.
Sure.
And eventually leads to this major turning point, the U.S. handing control back to Panama.
Right, in 1999. Based on these agreements called the Torrijos-Carter treaties, signed back in 1977.
So after what, almost a century of U.S. control?
Yep.
The canal is finally back in Panamanian hands.
It was a huge moment for Panama, for the region, really for the world.
These treaties, though, they seem pretty important to understanding what's happening now.
Oh, they're crucial.
Can we just break down the key points for anyone who's not, up on their Panama Canal treaty history?
Sure. First off, Panama gets full control.
Yeah.
Sovereignty over the canal.
Okay.
That's non-negotiable from that point of view.
Right.
Second, the canal has to stay neutral, open to ships from every country.
Makes sense.
But, and this is a big but, the U.S. kept the right to intervene if they think that neutrality is threatened.
So it's like, here's your canal back, but we're keeping an eye on things.
Yeah, you could put it that way.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the current mess. President Trump, second term, and his very loud demand to take back the Panama Canal.
Yes. President Trump, never one to mince words.
Not exactly.
But he didn't just talk, did he? Didn't his administration actually do stuff to, like, back up those words?
Oh, absolutely. One of the first things they did, well, it raised some eyebrows, let's just say. They sent Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, on a very pointed little trip to Panama.
Okay, so where you're going with this. Rubio shows up right after Trump's Take Back the Canal speech. That sends a message, for sure.
It does.
But what's Trump's argument here? Why does he think the U.S. should just take it back after all these years?
He's got two main points. One, he says Panama is charging unfair fees, like they're squeezing extra money out of the ships. And two, he's saying Panama is getting way too cozy with China.
Okay, so it's about money and China. Sounds familiar coming from President Trump.
Yeah, a bit.
But let's break it down. What are these unfair fees he's complaining about?
Well, there were some things happening. 2023, early 2024. Panama got hit with some serious droughts.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about that.
And that meant less water in the canal. So fewer ships could pass through. Some ships had to wait, like, weeks.
Ouch.
To deal with that, Panama said they had to raise the fees to keep things running.
Okay, I can see that. If you have to limit traffic, you got to make up the difference somehow.
Right. And then in 2025, the Panama Canal Authority, they increased fees again, this time for reserving transit slots.
Transit slots.
You know, like booking your spot in line. And those fees, they jumped up a lot. For big ships like the ones carrying oil and gas, the reservation fee for the older, smaller locks went from $41,000 to $50,000.
Wow.
And for the newer, larger locks, the ones built during the expansion, those fees went from $80,000 to $100,000.
Okay, that's a pretty hefty price hike. I can see why Trump might be raising a fuss about that.
Yeah.
You mentioned older locks and newer locks. You're talking about the Panamax and Neo-Panamax thing?
Exactly. Panamax refers to the maximum size of ships that could fit through the original canal. Then, back in the early 2000s, they did this massive expansion project, added a whole new set of locks, the Neo-Panamax locks, much bigger, to accommodate the supersized cargo ships we have now.
Right, so bigger ships, bigger fees. It makes sense from a business standpoint, but I can also see how President Trump might spin that as Panama trying to take advantage of the U.S.
Definitely.
But let's move on to his other accusation, the China situation. What's the deal there? Is Panama really becoming best buds with China and leaving the U.S. out in the cold?
Well, there's no question that China has been making some serious moves in Panama, investing in all sorts of projects, like they're operating ports at both ends of the canal. They funded this huge $1.4 billion bridge.
Right.
They're putting money into energy facilities. And there's even this controversial plan for a Chinese-backed water management system right in the canal zone.
Hold on, water management. What does that even mean?
It's a bit complicated, but basically it would give China control over a significant chunk of Panama's water resources for like the next 50 years.
50 years. That's a long time.
It is. And it's making a lot of people nervous, both in Panama and in the U.S.
So you've got China pouring money into Panama, building infrastructure, getting involved in essential resources like water. Yeah, I can see how that might raise some red flags, especially for the U.S.
Yeah, it's definitely got people in Washington worried. They're seeing this as a potential threat. Like, China could use this leverage to disrupt the canal's operations, or even try to take control of it completely.
Okay, now things are getting really interesting. But before we jump into that, we've got to talk about how the U.S. has been reacting to all of this. They haven't just been sitting back and watching.
Oh,
no?
Definitely not. And some of their reactions have actually, well, they've kind of made things worse.
Uh-oh. This sounds like it's about to get even more complicated.
It does.
Well, I guess that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right? It's like this crazy mix of history, economics, politics, global power struggles, all focused on this one little strip of water. We'll have to unpack all of that and what the U.S. has been up to when we come back for part 2. All right, we're back, diving deeper into this Panama Canal saga. Last time, we left off with China really making its presence known in Panama, ports, bridges, even getting involved with their water. It's pretty intense.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions. Is the U.S. right to be worried? What are the stakes for everyone involved? How do all these pieces fit together?
Yeah, it's like a puzzle, isn't it? A geopolitical puzzle. Let's start with the U.S. Obviously, they're concerned about China. But why is the canal so important to them in the first place? There are other ways to ship stuff around the world.
Oh, absolutely. But the canal, it's a shortcut. Shaves weeks off travel time. And that means lower shipping costs, which ultimately translates to lower prices for goods.
So if the canal were to be disrupted or worse, controlled by someone who's not exactly friendly to the U.S.
It would be a huge blow. Economically, for the U.S., a ton of those goods come from Asia through the canal to the East Coast. Disrupt that flow, and prices could skyrocket.
Okay, so there's the economic impact. But you mentioned something earlier about a national security aspect, too.
Right. The canal's also a critical piece for the U.S. military. They need to be able to move their ships quickly between the Atlantic and the Pacific. For global operations, responding to crises, the canal is essential for that.
So it's strategic, not just about the bottom line.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the U.S. perspective. Worried about losing access, losing influence. But what about Panama? It's their country, their canal. What's at stake for them?
Well, for Panama, the canal's more than just a waterway. It's their national pride, a symbol of their sovereignty.
Yeah, I can see that.
And it's a huge part of their economy, of course. They've been managing it successfully for over 2 decades now. They're not about to just give up control.
So it's about more than just money. It's about their identity, their independence.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the U.S. worried about China, Panama determined to hold on to its control, and then there's China, pouring money into projects, building relationships. It's starting to feel like a three-way tug of war, isn't it?
It is. You've got these competing interests, these different strategies playing out. China's approach, it's interesting. It's a mix of economic engagement and soft power.
Soft power? You mean like cultural influence and stuff?
Yeah, sort of. It's about persuasion, building relationships, creating positive associations, rather than using force or coercion.
So win them over, not beat them down.
Exactly. And it's pretty effective, especially in a region where the U.S. has a bit of a reputation for being heavy-handed.
Oh, I bet. So while the U.S. is focused on military might, China's over there building bridges, literally and figuratively.
Right. And it's making the U.S. nervous. They see it as a direct challenge to their influence. And they're not sure how to respond. Some people are saying the U.S. needs to be more assertive, push back against China.
You mean like flex their muscles a bit, show them who's boss?
Yeah. Some people think that's the only way to stop China's growing influence. They're talking about economic sanctions, maybe even military action.
But wouldn't that just make things worse? Push Panama further away from the U.S.?
That's the risk. A lot of experts are saying that a heavy-handed approach would backfire, damage the U.S.'s reputation, and make China look even better.
So if that's not the answer, what is? Is there another way for the U.S. to protect its interests without making things worse?
There are some people advocating for a different approach, one based on diplomacy and cooperation.
So working with Panama, not against them.
Right, building stronger relationships, addressing Panama's concerns, finding common ground. It's a more nuanced approach.
But wouldn't that mean the U.S. has to accept that they're not the only superpower calling the shots anymore?
That's the challenge. The world is changing. The U.S. can't just dictate terms like they used to. They need to adapt to this new reality.
So they have a choice. Stick with the old playbook, which might not work so well anymore, or try something new, something more collaborative.
Exactly. It's a tough call. And then there's the question of Panama. Are they just caught in the middle of all this? Or are they playing their own game?
That's what I'm wondering. They've got to have their own agenda, right? They're not just sitting there waiting for the U.S. or China to tell them what to do.
Exactly. Panama's a lot more strategic than that. They're playing a very clever game, and that's what we'll be diving into next.
Okay, so we're back, wrapping up our deep dive on the Panama Canal. We've talked about the history, U.S. interests, China's moves. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. A lot of moving parts. And we left off talking about how Panama's right in the thick of it.
Yeah, trying to chart their own course with the U.S. and China both kind of breathing down their necks. It's got to be tricky.
Oh, it's a high-wire act, for sure. But they're managing it pretty well so far. They know how important the canal is, not just for them, but for pretty much everyone.
Right. It's a global choke point, basically.
Exactly. And their goal is to stay in control, keep it running smoothly, and make sure Panama benefits as much as possible.
Makes sense. But how do they pull that off? With the U.S. and China both kind of vying for influence.
They're playing it smart. They're welcoming Chinese investment, which helps them economically and gives them some leverage, against the U.S.
Right.
But they're also staying close to the U.S., cooperating on security, reassuring them that the canal will stay neutral.
So they're not picking a side. They're trying to keep everyone happy.
It's more than that. They're using the situation to their advantage. It's a delicate balancing act, but it seems to be working.
It's pretty impressive when you think about it. They're this relatively small country, but they're holding their own against these two global giants.
Yeah, it is. They're not just reacting either. They've got their own vision for the future of the canal.
Really? What are they planning?
Well, for one thing, they're investing a lot in modernization, making it more efficient, so it can handle even more traffic.
As global trade keeps growing.
Right. And they're also trying to diversify their economy, not putting all their eggs in the canal basket, so to speak.
Smart move. Makes them less dependent on any one thing. Okay, so back to the U.S. for a minute. Knowing all this, what's the best move for them if they want to protect their interests and make sure they still have access to the canal?
That's the million-dollar question. The old playbook, trying to dictate terms, using force, that's just not going to work. Not anymore.
So what's the alternative? Just let China take over?
No, it's not about that. It's about understanding that the world has changed. The U.S. needs to adapt, build real partnerships based on mutual respect, not just on power.
So more cooperation, less confrontation. Is that really enough, though, especially with China being so aggressive?
It's not just about being nice. The U.S. needs to step up its game economically, offer Panama good deals, help them develop, show them that they're a reliable partner.
So it's about building trust and competing with China on a level playing field.
It's a long game. It's about recognizing that the U.S. can't just dictate terms anymore. They need to be smart, strategic.
So what does all of this mean for the Panama Canal? What's the future look like?
It's tough to predict. A lot depends on the choices that the U.S., China, and Panama make. If the U.S. keeps trying to bully Panama, it'll probably backfire, push them closer to China.
But if they change their approach, there's a chance for a better outcome.
Maybe. A scenario where the canal keeps running smoothly, benefiting everyone. Where the U.S. and China find ways to coexist without things getting out of control.
Well, that's something to hope for. This whole deep dive has been fascinating. It really shows you how complex the world is, right?
Absolutely. The Panama Canal is just this little strip of water, but it's connected to everything. Economics, politics, global power.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together, in a way. Whether we like it or not, we need to find ways to work together to solve these problems, or things could get really messy.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the Panama Canal. Thanks for listening, and hopefully you'll keep exploring these issues. It's important stuff.
It is.
Until next time.